A couple went camping with their dog in Shenandoah National Park, Virginia. A week later, their golden retriever was found wandering along a trail near Skyland Lodge. No one knew what had happened until...
Early morning in the Shenandoah National Park. Ethan Winter and Jeannie Seipel are still rubbing the sleep out of their eyes when they learn about the murders.
Holy, that doesn't happen in national parks at all, really, does it? I mean, that's extraordinary.
Just hours earlier, 2 women had been found murdered. No struggle, no witnesses, and no one was ever convicted. For 3 decades, the Shenandoah Park murders remained one of the most haunting cases for hikers and outdoor enthusiasts. In the end, a biological sample from the victim's underwear finally revealed the killer's identity. To understand how he stayed hidden for so long, we have to go back to where it all began. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a scream or a sighting. It was a lone golden retriever named Taj. The dog was found wandering the trails near the Skyland Lodge, unleashed and unaccompanied. A jarring anomaly in a landscape where domestic animals are tethered by both law and necessity. Taj was a gentle animal, showing no signs of the violence that had occurred, yet his presence alone on the ridges signaled a profound break in the human order. In the late spring of 1996, the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia offered a deceptively tranquil sanctuary. As the Memorial Day weekend approached, Shenandoah National Park became a magnet for hundreds of thousands of visitors seeking the serenity of the Appalachian Trail and the scenic vistas of Skyline Drive. Among them were those who sought the deepest isolation the backcountry could provide, a choice that, in the vast, federally protected wilderness, carries a silent, inherent risk. The park itself spans more than 200,000 acres of rugged terrain, a scale that makes comprehensive surveillance nearly impossible. During this period, the National Park Service was already facing a widening gap between rising visitor numbers and a shrinking federal budget, leaving the deeper interior to a small, specialized branch of law enforcement and the thin protection of administrative protocols. By May 31st, the silence from the wilderness had become deafening for the families of 24-year-old Julianne Williams and 26-year-old Lollie Winans. Julie's father, Tom Williams, had last seen his daughter during an idyllic Easter trip to Florida just weeks earlier, a memory now in stark contrast to the growing dread of the unknown. When the women failed to return home as scheduled, a formal missing persons report triggered a mobilization of park rangers. The investigation initially centered on the logistical trail the women had left behind. Their vehicle was located just north of Skyland Lodge, but the interior revealed no signs of a struggle or forced departure. In the 1990s, locating missing hikers depended heavily on the backcountry permit system, a mandatory administrative requirement that served as a crucial survival link. These documents, which Julie and Lollie had carefully filed, provided rangers with a general radius of their intended movements and an estimated timeline of their stay. Even so, searching for individuals in the Shenandoah backcountry is a battle against geography. Because the land is federally managed, local and state authorities lack immediate jurisdiction, leaving the initial investigation to the National Park Service's Investigative Services Branch. While highly trained in forest forensics, these agents were few in number compared to the vast terrain they were responsible for covering. They often operated within what has been described as a missing 411 vacuum, a systemic blind spot in which centralized records of disappearances and violent crimes were historically incomplete. As the search intensified on the evening of June 1, 1996, rangers focused their efforts on a nearby bridle trail, a popular horse path near Skyland Lodge. Their search was guided by the last known clue, the location where Taj had been found. The assumption was simple and grim. A domestic dog rarely wanders far from its owner's final location. It was there, hidden from the view of casual hikers, that they found the campsite. The women had been diligent and experienced campers. They were acutely aware of park regulations, which mandated that backcountry campsites remain invisible from major trails to preserve the aesthetic experience for other tourists. Consequently, they had pitched their bright yellow tent in a secluded spot near a stream, roughly 250 yards from Skyline Drive. This adherence to the rules, this desire for privacy and environmental respect, had tragically worked in a predator's favor, ensuring that their camp remained hidden from the thousands of Memorial Day travelers passing just a short distance away. The campsite was found in a state of chaotic disarray, with clothing and gear strewn across the forest floor. The yellow tent had partially collapsed. Inside the fabric ruins, the rangers found the body of Lollie Winans bound with duct tape and gagged, her remains wrapped within her sleeping bag. A short distance away near a stand of trees lay Julianne Williams. She, too, had been bound and gagged, her throat cut with clinical precision. The brutality was absolute. There was no evidence of a struggle that had spilled out into the wider woods, suggesting the attack had been swift, controlled, and horrifyingly efficient. The discovery immediately initiated a jurisdictional shift. While the National Park Service police and state authorities secured the perimeter, the federal nature of the crime required the intervention of the FBI. This transition, however, created a 36-hour delay in notifying the public. As federal agents traveled to the remote ridge, other campers remained in the park, unaware that a double homicide had occurred or that a killer might still be moving through the brush. The silence of the authorities during these first 2 days would later become a point of intense local scrutiny, highlighting the friction between the need for forensic integrity and the duty to warn the public of an active threat. When the FBI finally arrived, they faced a forensic nightmare. The wilderness is an active environment that works quickly to erase evidence. Weather, insects, and the movement of local wildlife can degrade a crime scene in a matter of hours. Despite these challenges, agents recovered several critical items: a glove that did not belong to the women and a length of duct tape used in the bindings. Within the adhesive of the tape and the fibers of the glove, investigators found several strands of hair, biological signatures that did not match Lollie or Julie. As the crime scene was processed, a camera was recovered among the women's belongings. The film inside provided a hauntingly clear timeline of their final days, beginning on May 19th when they first arrived in the park. The images showed two women deeply in love with the natural world and each other, capturing moments of a journey that was intended to be a celebration of new beginnings. On May 21st, the photos documented a heavy storm that had forced them to seek a brief reprieve at a park lodge where they renewed their permits. The final images, dated May 24th, showed them climbing Hawksbill Mountain, their faces reflecting the high spirits of a successful excursion. It was within 48 to 72 hours of those last smiles being captured on film that the perpetrator had moved into their lives. The forensic analysis of the campsite revealed a disturbing detail about the mechanics of the crime. DNA analysis of the duct tape suggested that the same piece of tape had been moved from Julie's mouth to Lollie's wrists. This repurposing of materials suggested a killer who was either working with limited supplies or one who derived a specific psychological satisfaction from the shared trauma of his victims. Furthermore, the bindings were mismatched. While Julie's ankles were secured with tape, Lollie's had been tied with a pair of thermal underwear. To investigators, this indicated an escalating or opportunistic violence, a predator adapting his methods in real time as he subdued two physically fit, outdoors-trained women. To understand the weight of the loss felt in the wake of the discovery, one must look at the lives that were meticulously built before they were so abruptly dismantled. But before we go further, I'm curious. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. It's powerful to see how far Lollie and Julianne's story travels and how it continues to connect us all, even decades later. Lollie Winans was born into the quiet affluence of Grosse Pointe, Michigan, a suburb defined by its historical architecture and suburban prestige. Yet, from a young age, Lollie exhibited a profound disconnect from the stuffy, modern comforts of her upbringing. She was a woman who sought the raw and the unrefined, eventually finding her purpose in the rugged landscapes of Vermont and Maine. Her journey was not without significant shadows. She was a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, a trauma that had led her through bouts of depression and struggles with alcohol. However, by 1996, Lollie had transformed her pain into a mission. At Unity College, she maintained a perfect 4.0 grade point average, specializing in wilderness guide training. Her dream was to establish retreats where other survivors of trauma could find healing through the same natural environments that had saved her. She was a woman of infectious energy, known to her friends for her air drumming to Phil Collins and a laugh that seemed to radiate from a place of hard-won peace. Julianne Williams, known to her loved ones as Julie, was a mirror to Lollie's intensity and empathy. Raised in St. Cloud, Minnesota, Julie was a natural scholar and a formidable athlete, a Minnesota State doubles champion in tennis who carried her competitive spirit into the field of geology at Carleton College. Her peers described her as a one-person Peace Corps, a woman whose activism was as deeply rooted as her love for the Earth's crust. By the time she graduated cum laude, she had dedicated herself to social justice and ecological preservation. It was this shared affinity for the wilderness that led both women to the Woods Women Organization in the summer of 1995. During a canoeing excursion through the Boundary Waters, they shared a tent and a canoe, discovering a chemistry that transcended their shared interests. For both Lollie and Julie, this was their first serious same-sex relationship, and it blossomed during a period of complex social transition in America. While the mid-1990s saw the beginning of increased visibility for the LGBTQ community, the reality on the ground remained fraught with peril. It was a time of don't ask, don't tell, and intense religious scrutiny, particularly for someone like Julie, whose upbringing in Minnesota made reconciling her sexuality with her faith a deliberate, sometimes private struggle. They had recently moved into a home in Huntington, Vermont, sharing their lives with Taj and celebrating Julie's new grant to conduct hydrology research on Lake Champlain. Their decision to camp 250 yards off-road in Shenandoah was a reflection of this intersection of their lives. A desire for professional backcountry isolation and a need for the private sanctuary that the society of 1996 did not yet fully afford them. The investigation into their deaths was immediately haunted by the specter of other violence in the region. As the FBI struggled to find a motive, the public began to draw chilling parallels to a series of crimes that had plagued the Virginia corridor for years. Chief among these was the mystery of the Route 29 stalker. Just months before Lollie and Julie arrived in Virginia, a 25-year-old graduate student named Alicia Showalter Reynolds had disappeared while driving from Baltimore to Charlottesville. Her vehicle was found abandoned on the shoulder of Route 29, a white napkin tucked under the windshield wiper, a universal signal for mechanical failure. The car, however, was in perfect working order. This detail unlocked a flood of reports from dozens of other women who described a similar encounter. A tall, blond man who would signal drivers to pull over, claiming he saw sparks or smoke coming from their vehicles. Some of these women had accepted rides. One was even forced to leap from a moving car, breaking her ankle in the process. When Alicia's body was discovered in a field in July 1996, the realization took hold that a predator was using the region's transit arteries as a hunting ground. This created a climate of regional dread that loomed over the Shenandoah investigation. If the killer was not a random drifter in the woods, he might be a local predator who understood the legal and geographical seams between the highways and the high ridges. The FBI was forced to consider whether Lollie and Julie were victims of this same opportunistic killer, or if they had been targeted for a more specific, hateful reason. The question of whether the murders were a hate crime became a focal point of the investigation after a friend of the couple, Reverend Rebecca Steiner, confirmed their romantic relationship to the media. While some saw this disclosure as a breach of the women's privacy, it forced law enforcement to look at the crime scene through a different lens. A hate-motivated killer often leaves behind a signature of overkill, a level of violence that exceeds what is necessary to commit a homicide. intended instead to send a message or desecrate the identity of the victims. The binding and gagging, combined with the precision of the throat slashing, fit the profile of a perpetrator who sought total control and subjugation. This lead eventually brought the authorities to a man whose erratic behavior in the park would provide the FBI with their first significant suspect. Darrell David Rice, a 30-year-old from Charlottesville, had no prior criminal record, but his life was a testament to escalating misogyny. He had recently been fired from his job for creating a hostile environment, characterized by his habit of stealing co-workers' lunches, punching holes in bathroom walls, and screaming sexual profanities at women. In 1997, a year after the Shenandoah murders, Rice was arrested after a terrifying incident on Skyline Drive. He had targeted a Canadian cyclist, Yvonne Malbassa, attempting to run her off the road and screaming that he was going to get her. When he was apprehended, police found hand and leg restraints inside his truck. For an investigative team under immense pressure to solve a high-profile federal case, Rice appeared to be the perfect personification of the violence that had claimed Lollie and Julie. The FBI's case against Darrell Rice was built not on forensic certainty, but on a psychological profile and a series of digital footprints. Investigators meticulously reviewed hours of grain-filled surveillance footage from the park's entrance gates at Front Royal and Rockfish Gap. The records showed that Rice's vehicle had entered the park at 8:05 p.m. on May 25, 1996, and again at 4:57 p.m. the following day. When confronted with this data, Rice's defense was a flat denial, a contradiction of the mechanical record that only served to deepen the investigators' suspicions. To the federal team, Rice was more than a suspect. He was a candidate for a landmark legal victory. In 2001, Attorney General John Ashcroft announced that the federal government would seek the death penalty for Rice, utilizing the 1994 Hate Crimes Sentencing Enhancement Act. This move was culturally and legally significant. It was the first time federal prosecutors attempted to use the act to enhance a murder charge to a capital offense based on the victim's sexual orientation. The institutional pressure to secure a conviction was immense. A successful prosecution would not only solve a haunting double homicide, but would also signal a new era of federal protection for marginalized groups. However, this high-stakes legal strategy was anchored to a forensic foundation that was beginning to crumble. The primary physical evidence consisted of the hairs recovered from the duct tape and the discarded glove found at the campsite. In the mid-1990s, forensic hair analysis was a standard but limited tool. Microscopic comparison could suggest a match based on shared characteristics like color, thickness, and cuticle patterns, but it lacked the absolute certainty of modern DNA profiling. As the trial neared in 2004, advancements in mitochondrial DNA testing allowed for a more definitive analysis. Unlike nuclear DNA, which requires the root of the hair, mtDNA can be extracted from the shaft. When the results finally arrived from the laboratory, they delivered a devastating blow to the prosecution's case. The hairs found at the crime scene did not belong to Darrell Rice. Faced with this biological exclusion, the federal government was forced to retreat, but they did so with a strategic legal maneuver. They dismissed the charges against Rice without prejudice. This specific legal designation meant that while Rice was free to leave, he was not exonerated. In the eyes of the law, the case remained in a state of suspended animation. The government reserved the right to re-indict him at any moment should new evidence surface. This left Rice in a permanent legal purgatory, a status that would eventually draw the attention of the Virginia Innocence Project, which argued that the FBI's tunnel vision had allowed the true perpetrator to remain in the shadows for nearly a decade. While the FBI had been focused on Rice, a more prolific and terrifying predator had been operating in the same Virginia corridor. In the summer of 2002, the world learned the name of Richard Evenitz. His crimes came to light only after the harrowing escape of 15-year-old Kara Robinson, who had been abducted at gunpoint from a friend's driveway in South Carolina. Robinson, showing extraordinary presence of mind, managed to free herself from restraints while Evanet slept, leading authorities to his apartment. Inside, police discovered a trophy room of evidence linking Evanets to the unsolved murders of 3 young girls in Virginia, Sophia Silva and sisters Kristen and Katie Lisk. Evanets fled toward Florida, eventually ending his own life during a police standoff. His final words to his sister over the phone were a cryptic admission. He had committed more crimes than he could count. As investigators began to peel back the layers of Evanets' life, the parallels to the Shenandoah case became impossible to ignore. Evanets was a man who thrived on the jurisdictional gaps between cities and states, often remarking to friends that he admired serial killers like Ted Bundy for their ability to exploit law enforcement's lack of communication. The circumstantial evidence against Evanets in the deaths of Lollie and Julie was compelling. During the Memorial Day weekend of 1996, his family could not account for his whereabouts for 2 full days, the exact window in which the murders occurred. His former wives told police that Evanets frequently visited Shenandoah National Park, but he would paradoxically warn them never to go there alone, because dangerous people lurked in the woods. Perhaps most chillingly, he had expressed a specific, violent fantasy regarding pairs of women. Despite these leads, the institutional momentum that had been directed toward Darrell Rice for years proved difficult to redirect. For decades, the families of Lollie and Julie watched as the investigation into Richard Evanets stalled. The FBI's reluctance to conduct a full forensic comparison between Evanets' DNA and the hair from the Shenandoah campsite became a source of profound frustration for the victims' loved ones. It suggested an uncomfortable reality that admitting the possibility of Evanets' guilt would mean acknowledging that the federal government had spent years and millions of dollars pursuing the wrong man while a serial killer continued to hunt. This forensic and legal stalemate lasted until the 2020s, when a new wave of technology began to dissolve the cold cases of the 20th century. The emergence of investigative genetic genealogy, the same process used to identify the Golden State Killer, offered a new hope for the evidence locked in the Shenandoah files. But even with this new technology, the case refused to move forward. In 2021, the FBI attempted to break the deadlock by shifting its investigative strategy. Recognizing that Shenandoah National Park is a transient space, a crossroads for hikers and travelers from across the globe, the Bureau launched a national call for information. This was a strategic admission that the killer might not have been a local drifter or a known predator from the Virginia corridor, but perhaps a visitor who has since blended back into a community thousands of miles away. The FBI's focus expanded to include anyone who may have frequented local establishments or trails in the late spring of 1996, working under the theory that even a seemingly insignificant memory of a strange encounter could be the final piece of the forensic puzzle. The institutional failures identified in the wake of the Shenandoah murders have also sparked a broader conversation about how the United States protects those within its national parks. Advocacy groups like the National Park Conservation Association have long argued that the lack of a centralized, transparent database for crimes committed on federal land is a systemic flaw. While the Park Service receives over 300 million visits annually, the statistical tracking of violence remains decentralized and often underfunded. The murders of Lollie and Julie became a primary case study for those demanding better federal funding for park security, arguing that the 1 in a million chance of a violent encounter is a statistic that offers little comfort to those left in the wake of a tragedy. And still, the central question remained unanswered. That began to shift in 2024, when the FBI's renewed interest in the case coincided with major breakthroughs in other regional mysteries, most notably the Colonial Parkway murders. In February 2024, the FBI announced that they had finally linked a deceased local man, Alan Wilmer Sr., to multiple murders on the Parkway through modern DNA testing. While Wilmer was not a suspect in the Shenandoah case, the breakthrough proved that the answers were no longer lost in the woods. They were waiting in the genetic code of the evidence, The legacy of Lollie Winans and Julie Williams survives not just in the ongoing quest for justice, but in the tangible impact they left on the world. The Julianne Williams Fund has distributed over $7 million since its inception, funding environmental education and outdoor empowerment programs for young women. It is a legacy that reflects the essence of who they were. Two women who saw the wilderness not as a place of fear, but as a site of profound healing and social change. Their story remains a testament to a specific era of American history, a time when the beauty of the national parks was shadowed by the limitations of forensic science and the complexities of human prejudice. At the same time, despite these advances, the legal mechanics of the Shenandoah case remained stalled in a frustrating, technical limbo. The decision to dismiss the charges against Darrell Rice without prejudice created a rare and agonizing legal paradox. In American law, the principle of double jeopardy usually prevents a person from being tried twice for the same crime once a jury has been impaneled. However, because the federal government withdrew the charges on the eve of jury selection, Rice never technically entered jeopardy. Consequently, he remains in a state of permanent suspicion, a status that the Virginia Innocence Project has cited as a profound miscarriage of justice. This legal limbo serves as a microcosm of the entire investigation, a series of near misses and procedural deadlocks that have left the families without a definitive conclusion. The resolution didn't come from a sudden tip or a dramatic confession. It began quietly with the reopening of the case in 2021, when Stanley Meter took over as special agent in charge of the FBI's Richmond field office. He assigned a new investigative team to conduct an exhaustive review of every piece of evidence, photograph, and interview collected since 1996. The team approached the case with a simple idea. The answers weren't missing. They were just locked behind the limits of earlier technology. For more than 2 decades, the investigation had been stalled by a single barrier. Although the FBI had long possessed biological evidence from the scene, the samples had been degraded by the harsh conditions of the forest floor, making them unsuitable for CODIS, the National DNA Database. At the time, the technology needed to generate a usable profile simply didn't exist. To break this stalemate, the new investigative team secured a specialized grant through the Department of Justice's Sexual Assault Kit initiative. This funding allowed the FBI to bypass standard bureaucratic bottlenecks and leverage the advanced extraction techniques of an accredited private laboratory. Unlike the public labs of the Darrell Rice era, this private facility possessed the sensitivity required to pull a clean DNA profile from the long silent evidence. The result was a forensic breakthrough that finally allowed the FBI to upload a profile into the national system. Almost immediately, the digital architecture of CODIS produced a match, identifying a man who had successfully remained in the periphery of the Shenandoah investigation for 28 years. Walter Leo Jackson, Sr. Known as Leo to those in his orbit, Jackson was a residential painter from the Cleveland, Ohio area, whose life was a repetitive cycle of incarceration and predation. He was a man who moved through the world as a phantom, frequently changing vehicles and altering license plates to evade the notice of law enforcement. In 1996, the year of the murders, Jackson would have been seen navigating the winding roads of Virginia in a 1984 chestnut brown AMC Eagle, a vehicle that allowed him to blend into the mountain landscape as just another avid hiker. This detail provided a chilling new perspective on the crime. Jackson was not a random drifter, but a man who held a deep, practiced interest in Shenandoah National Park. He understood its trails, its seasonal rhythms, and most crucially, its jurisdictional blind spots. The identification of Jackson forced a profound and uncomfortable shift in the narrative motive. For decades, the case had been defined by the federal government's pursuit of a hate crime conviction, predicated on the belief that Lollie and Julie were targeted for their sexual orientation. However, the 2024 forensic reconstruction revealed a different, more predatory reality. The new testing confirmed that both women had been sexually assaulted, a fact that had remained unproven during the initial investigation. When federal prosecutors compared the Shenandoah evidence to Jackson's criminal history, a terrifying pattern of serial violence emerged. Just days after the murders on June 5, 1996, Jackson had returned to Ohio and kidnapped a woman at knife point. A month later, he struck again, breaking into a home to commit another knife-point rape. These crimes, committed alone and with the same clinical subjugation seen at the campsite, suggested that Jackson was not a man motivated by a specific ideological hatred, but a serial predator who viewed the isolation of the Blue Ridge as an ideal hunting ground. This revelation necessitated a formal pivot from the Department of Justice. U.S. Attorney Christopher Kavanaugh addressed the legacy of the hate crime theory, noting that while the murders were definitionally hateful in their brutality, there was no evidence Jackson had any knowledge of the women's relationship or their membership in a protected class. This analysis underscored a recurring theme in the history of the case: how the institutional desire for a landmark legal victory had occasionally obscured the forensic reality of a lone, mobile predator. The certainty of Jackson's guilt was later anchored by a direct comparison between the crime scene evidence and a buccal swab of his DNA, yielding a match statistic of 1 in 2.6 trillion, a level of forensic absolute that rendered all previous theories, including those involving Darrell Rice or Richard Evanitz, obsolete. However, the discovery was met with a sense of stolen justice. Walter Leo Jackson, Sr., had died in March 2018 while serving a prison sentence for a 2011 kidnapping. He had escaped the finality of a federal indictment by a mere 6 years, never having to answer for the lives he stole in Shenandoah or the decade of legal purgatory he indirectly forced upon Darrell Rice. There would be no trial, no formal sentencing, and no opportunity for the victims' families to face the man who had shattered their world. Instead, the resolution arrived as a small measure of solace. When the FBI and federal prosecutors spoke to the families of Lollie and Julie in June 2024, they did so to offer closure rather than a conviction. The families, who had spent nearly 3 decades seeking answers, expressed a profound gratitude for the persistence of the new investigative team, a team that refused to let the case go cold simply because the primary suspect was deceased. The announcement served as a final, official vindication for Lollie and Julie, stripping away the decades of speculation and centering the truth on the forensic facts. The story of the Shenandoah Park murders concludes not in a courtroom, but in the enduring legacy of the 2 women, a legacy that continues to move forward long after the case itself fell silent. The Julianne Williams Fund still empowers young women in the outdoors, carrying forward the same sense of purpose and freedom that Julie and Lollie believed in so deeply. The 1984 AMC Eagle and The Painter from Cleveland have been pushed into the archives of criminal history, but the impact of Lollie's laughter and Julie's quiet determination hasn't faded. It lives on in the communities they shaped and in the lives they never stopped influencing. As the sun sets over the Blue Ridge, the silence near Skyland Lodge no longer belongs to the unknown. The phantom has a name now. The evidence has finally spoken. And after 28 years, Lollie Winans and Julianne Williams are no longer tied to a question without an answer, but to a truth that arrived far too late. And maybe that's where this story leaves us. Not with closure, but with something more complicated. Because what does justice really mean in a case like this, when the answer comes decades after it could have changed everything? If the technology we have today had existed back then, how different would this story have been? And how many others might have been spared? Take a moment and think about that. And if this case stayed with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. After everything you've heard, do you believe the truth on its own is ever enough?